Yeah, I'm just in. I'm just in there. It's 20 past. Lovely. Throw that away.
Sorry, slid off the table.
There. Good, there we go. Okay, we'll get you sorted. So that's the ticket and all?
Yeah.
Go buy another one, you know?
No.
It's a bit worse. We'll do it this way, yeah.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Queen's for our autumn session of lectures. You're all very welcome. Nice to see a few new faces as well. And I hope you've all had a great summer, been to some interesting places and seen some nice archaeological sites, whether at home or abroad. So just before I introduce our speaker tonight, just go through a few of the usual housekeeping bits and bobs. So I say we're not expecting any problems this evening. But should the fire alarms go, then I could ask you please to make your way out the exits, two at the back of the lecture theatre and two at the front here, and assemble in front of the building, is where you came in. There's a sheet going round. If you could please sign in so we know who's here this evening, make sure that everybody's accounted for. Could you make sure your mobiles are switched to silent or off, please, for the duration of the lecture? And likewise, those who are online, if you could please make sure that you're muted. Okay, well, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Will McGarry. Will's an archaeologist, GIS and heritage management specialist with over 20 years commercial and academic experience. He's a reader in archaeology here at Archaeology and Paleoecology at Queen's, active field archaeologist with an ongoing project relating to the Neolithic stone tool production in Shetland. His career has included time in commercial GIS and heritage management consultancy. He's worked at various World Heritage sites, including places like Brunaboyne and Machu Picchu. His particular interest in intersections between cultural heritage and climate change, the application and transferability of geospatial technology to archaeology and cultural heritage site management. He's a member of all sorts of institutes, including the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and a focal point for climate change there from 21 to 24. Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, also London, and has been very widely published. So we're delighted to have him here this evening to talk to us. on archaeological heritage management and the changing climate. Thanks, Will.
Thank you so much. That bio comes from the Queen's website, and whenever somebody says 20 years experience in archaeology, I think, oh, that's a lot. And then they list it all off, and you think, yeah, feels like it, you know. But listen, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a great privilege, honor to be back speaking to this esteemed and wonderful society again. I was thinking the last time I spoke to the Ulster Archaeology Society was during lockdown, and I spoke on a rather different topic then. I talked about my work that I do with colleagues up in the Shetland Islands in northern Scotland. I'm looking at Neolithic stone axe and tool production up there. But today, what I want to do is focus on something very different. And this really is focusing on an area that I've been working in for much of the last 5 to 10 years. And that is the intersection, as Anne says, between cultural heritage and climate change. And I want to speak a little bit today on both the impacts of climate change on cultural heritage and archaeology in particular, both within Ireland and also globally. I want to look at some and explore some examples of those impacts of ways in which our global archaeology is being impacted by climate change. Sometimes these talks can all seem rather negative, they can all seem rather hopeless. So I also want to spend some time thinking about how in these examples people have responded to this challenge and they've raised to this challenge in kind of unique and exciting ways, illustrating not just that heritage and archaeology is impacted by climate change, but actually through our heritage and through the knowledge of the past, we are able to respond to preserve these sites in exciting and often transferable ways. And then I want to finish my talk today talking about the unique role of archaeology and the unique role of archaeologists in actually rising to this challenge. And I want to make the point that as archaeologists, people who are used to loss, people for whom loss is at the heart of our discipline, we are very uniquely placed in the climate crisis to actually be able to respond to the preservation of cultural heritage in a broader sense, right? Not just our archaeological sites, but other things as well. So that's what I want to look at today. And I'd be absolutely delighted towards the end of the talk to have a discussion and have questions if people would like to do that. So climate impacts on heritage are global, right? It is a truly global phenomenon. There is not a single part of the planet where climate change is not affecting our heritage. And it's especially affecting our archaeological heritage. The nature of archaeological sites in that they are often ephemeral, they are often subsurface, they are often represented through subtle changes in soil or landscape, means that they are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The example on the screen here, the site of Jarlshof in Shetland, which for centuries has been eroded away by increasing storms and waves and rising sea levels. And that threat is being exacerbated exponentially by climate change. But beyond just these islands here, there have been successive and numerous studies over the last couple of decades in how heritage elsewhere is also being impacted by climate change. So in one study where Anderson et al., they recorded that 13,000 recorded archaeological sites are at direct risk from a 1 meter increase in sea levels. And this is in the American Southeast. In the Arctic, Jürgen Holleson's amazing study showing that of the 180,000 archaeological sites in the Arctic, up to 70% are at risk from permafrost thaw, coastal erosion, and microbial activity. And this is particularly acute in the Arctic areas where much of this material is organic, where it has been enclosed within permafrost for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And those are regions of the world that are experiencing global warming on a significantly higher level than other parts. So the scale of loss is almost hard to imagine. And then there have been other studies, quite high profile studies, looking at World Heritage sites. These are often the ones that make the news. We see them on the BBC, we see them on The Guardian. But one published back in 22 took a look at all these heritage sites around the coast of Africa and identified that 20% of them are at risk from extreme flood events by 2050, right, given a moderate future climate scenario. So this kind of sets a scene, right? It tells us that climate change is a global threat. It tells us that climate change is impacting our archaeological heritage, both here and also further afield. And over the last few years, we've seen some really wonderful projects on these islands looking at the impacts of climate change on our heritage. This particular infographic, which was produced by the Cherish project, which some of you might be familiar with, which was a collaboration between colleagues in the Discovery programme in Dublin and in Wales as well, sought to, amongst other things, create educational resources to raise awareness for local communities at all levels, from schools all the way up to heritage and archaeology groups like this, on the impacts of climate change, right? And I think this is a really powerful and effective way to communicate these kind of impacts. So it's not just on the things that we might expect, like coastal erosion leading to the loss of promontory forts, or maybe it's increased precipitation affecting the mortar of our built and vernacular heritage and castles. But it's also changes in sea temperature, that bring in new parasites and pests to underwater archaeological sites like shipwrecks, right? It's also the water becoming more saturated and inundated, and that exacerbating problems with footfall, causing erosion at archaeological sites. The impacts of climate change are broad, and they're complex, and they're often compounding, right? And they often aggregate with other things to create more challenge. This is perhaps one of the best examples from our own island. This is the site of Doonbeg, and I always remember this particularly well. This is a 3D model produced by the National Monument Service and also the Cherish project. And I always remember this because if ever you need to realize the power of heritage to communicate an issue, this was a really powerful one. Over the course of a storm, a large part of this monument was lost to coastal erosion, and the next day it was on the front page of all national newspapers. And there was a public outcry about the effects of climate change on heritage. These heritage places are important. They matter to people. They give people a sense of identity. They anchor us in place. And their loss is acutely and deeply felt by people and communities. And it makes heritage a uniquely powerful medium to be able to talk about the climate crisis and about our need to actually respond to it. And of course, it's not just archaeology, right? I think as archaeologists, like most of us in this room probably are, or archaeology fans, we do have a tendency sometimes to be very focused on archaeological sites. But of course, archaeological sites are part of broader landscapes. They fit within local traditions, both intangible and tangible. And these statistics from the UNESCO World Heritage Centre show that at present, 1 in 3 natural World Heritage sites are threatened by climate change, and some of the most famous ones being places like Yellowstone National Park in the USA or Malawi National Park in Malawi. 1 in 6 cultural heritage sites are threatened by climate change. This is not just archaeological sites, it's places like Venice, Rapa Nui. 60% of World Heritage forests are currently threatened, and 60% of marine World Heritage sites. So understanding the impacts to archaeology necessitates our also understanding the broader impacts of climate change on the landscape, and not just on our cultural heritage, but on our natural heritage also. And the nature of these impacts, like I said, are both very simple in some ways when we try and talk about them, but also quite complex. And they also happen over different scales, both spatial scales in terms of how different hazards and different impacts may affect the landscape. It may affect an entire portion of a country, like the Champagne region of France at the moment, where in about 10 years' time, they're not going to be able to grow champagne in most of that anymore. They're already, everything's having to move north. Or it might be quite acute. It might be affecting very specific sites happening in a very specific area. Some of them might happen very quickly. These are called rapid onset events, things like storms or floods or even heat waves, which temporarily happen quite fast and lead to things like forest fires, which can have huge impacts on both cultural landscapes and archaeological sites. But other events are slower than that, right? And they're harder to quantify, and sometimes they're harder to communicate. So something like sea level rise, which doesn't happen at the same pace all over the world. For a range of factors, in some places, the sea is rising faster than it is in other places. Loss of biodiversity or desertification happening because of rising temperatures are often happening over the course of generations. And these can be much harder for us to understand and communicate the impacts are. So what do we do about that? How do we respond to this challenge? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about a project which I established with colleagues from all over the world about 4 years ago, a project called Preserving Legacies. This brought together a wide range of people from across the world, from across the heritage sector, including archaeologists, including architects, including natural heritage people. And it developed, its vision was to create a world where not just heritage experts, but where communities, so those people most impacted by climate hazards, were empowered to lead climate adaptation. They were empowered to take action at their own heritage sites, to safeguard heritage and build resilience within their communities. And it is a project deeply focused on education and on training, which is something I feel really, really passionately about. Because in order to respond to climate change, in order to respond to this threat, this new threat, where we don't yet have the tools we need sometimes to respond to it, where very few of us received training on how to respond to climate change during our own education. We need new tools, we need new techniques. And so the Preserving Legacies project is very much about supporting local communities, supporting local heritage people, and providing them with the training, tools, and ability to adapt and react and respond to the threat of climate change at their most special places. To date, we work with 30 countries or 30 sites all over the world. The project is funded by the National Geographic Society based in the USA, and it's a collaboration between the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is the advisory body to UNESCO on World Heritage, and also the Climate Heritage Network. And the purpose of the project was to choose a really diverse, both geographically but also typologically, range of heritage sites. Okay, and this is because we learn as we do, right? That we in a lot of these cases we're developing methodologies and approaches to protect these sites, which are really specific to the needs of these individual communities and the nature of these sites. So some of these are familiar. They're some of the best known archaeological sites in the world. We've got places like Angkor in Cambodia, Petra in Jordan, two sites we'll return to. We also have industrial heritage sites, sites like the Rideau Canal, right? We have cultural landscapes like the Champagne hillsides or the Tijuana estuary on the border between Mexico and USA. We're working with indigenous people around the world in places like Mapoon in Cape York in Australia, or the Ifugao people of the northern Philippines, or the Guatobaro Salarenzo community in the Pantanal in Brazil. And we're also working with communities who live within natural landscapes, not known for their cultural heritage, but in places like Mongolia, in the Kurlan River Basin, or in the Okavango Delta on the Botswana and Namibia border. And each of these sites, we're working with local communities, some of whom are heritage professionals and some of whom are not, some of whom are interested local parties, members of community groups who have come together to try and protect their sites from the impacts of climate change. And these sites join us and they go through a 4-year journey where they receive training and resources and support to assess the risks to their sites and to come up with adaptation plans, to come up with plans that specifically address the risks that they are experiencing at their sites. A key part of this is that we work with local communities, and this means that we are locally led. So this is not Will McGarry from Queen's going to all these places and standing up and speaking to people with a translator. These are our local partners leading in their own languages, working with their own communities to learn from people how they are being impacted by climate change. Right? Some of those people are archaeologists coming from the local authority, like in the middle here. This is a workshop where my colleague Sharadina running it at Angkor, and you can see that they're literally running it right outside the temple, bringing together people from around the community, including archaeologists, including monks, including local communities, to speak about the impacts of climate change. Or on the left here, a community workshop at the site of Cartagena las Indias in Colombia, an incredible fortified naval city in the Caribbean, the gateway to the Caribbean, working with really, really underprivileged communities who live around the waterfront at that site and are most vulnerable, but they also live within the heritage landscape of that space. They live within the historic buildings, right? And then on the right, our colleague Mahfouz Darain from the University of Khulna, which is based on the edge of the Sundarbans, this incredible riverine delta which crosses the border between Bangladesh and India. And this is the site happened at the historic mosque city of Bagarhat, which is this incredible medieval Islamic settlement founded by the Turkish general Khan Jan Ali in the 16th century when he expanded across Asia. But again, it's sitting down, it's working with local communities, and it's providing training to them to be able to develop plans which work within their context. And as such, it's an incredibly bottom-up initiative, right? It's not that it doesn't involve experts, it does, but it also puts the kind of onus on the local community and listens to them. So what I'd like to do now is just for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, is look at 3 examples from this project, right? 3 of them are from this project. One is from a site we worked at prior to this project. Each of these 4 sites are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. I include them because they are perhaps some of the better known sites to people, but it will be important to note that it's often these very iconic sites which get a huge amount of the attention when we consider climate change, but they are representative of a far larger corpus of heritage site that gets no attention whatsoever and no resources. And as such, I think we have to, I used to use the phrase that these are the coalface and realize that's a rather unfortunate analogy when thinking about climate change, and then realize the tip of the iceberg was even worse, right? But I think that we should see them as representative of broader heritage sites in general and the actions we need to take to respond to it. So Skellig Vickel, which I'm sure will be familiar to many people in this room, an incredible monastic settlement situated off the southwest coast of the island of Ireland. The statement of outstanding universal value, the grounds upon which it was inscribed on the World Heritage Site, notes that it illustrates as no other property can the extremes of a Christian monasticism characterizing much of North Africa, the Near East and Europe. And I think one of the things that's striking about many of these places is they already speak to incredible resilience. They already speak to incredible adaptive capacity of communities who situated themselves in a landscape, in a seascape that was incredibly inhospitable already. And so there's an archaeological story and a narrative which began over 1,000 years ago, which continues into the present when we're thinking about preserving that legacy for future generations. Of course, Skellig Vickel is one of the most iconic archaeological sites in the island of Ireland. We would tend to focus on it from its archaeological significance, which is incredibly important. But of course, it's also a site of immense natural importance and significance. It is home to globally significant colonies of seabirds. It has natural fauna and flora that you don't find elsewhere. And so it's more than just an archaeological site. And perhaps on top of that, then, it's also a site of incredible economic and social importance to the community who rely on it. So the boats which bring people out, and there's been quite a lot of controversy about this recently, which I have not been involved in, but it's a crucial part of the local economy. And when we think of climate impacts, it's not just about walls falling down, right? It's not just about water getting into mortar. Climate impacts extend to these other values. They extend to the loss of the natural heritage, which makes that place important. They also extend to the loss of livelihoods, the economic impacts that they are experiencing here, because the increased storminess due to climate change is limiting the number of days that people are now able to visit the site. Right? And that is pushing up prices, and it's making it harder and harder for the local community to actually make a living from bringing people here. But perhaps the most pressing physical direct climate impact at the site of Skellig Vical are these rockfalls which periodically close the site. If you ever have a chance to visit, it really is an incredibly extreme and impressive a site. But every now and again, just these massive chunks of rock just roll down and take out a path, and there's huge fear and concern, obviously, for the impact, just the loss of life that may lead to from tourists, but also staff who work there. So in terms of responses at Skellig Vical, well, they've invested an awful lot of money in the construction of these barriers, these landslide barriers, right? So this is around the back of the island. Skellig Vical also has very interesting kind of 17th and 18th, 19th century architecture in the form of two lighthouses. And they've built these enormous barriers here to protect staff along in some of the areas that are most at risk. So this is what we would call hard defense, a hard adaptation, right? And the idea here is that, this would protect people from the most dangerous of rockfalls, right? But there's also kind of other ways of thinking about this, which is that there's a growing understanding that as less and less people may have the opportunity to actually visit the site, they need to diversify their offering to visitors and tourists to give slightly different experiences. So more and more people are arriving, having booked tickets often years and years in advance, to be told that the boat's not leaving today. So how do they respond to that? Well, they've got to offer alternative ways for people to enjoy the cultural heritage. Things like, for example, the new Skellig Experience Visitor Centre, where people can go and they can experience replicas of what they might have, and they can have other experiences. Now, it's very hard to argue that this could in any way take away from the experience of visiting such an incredible place. But it probably is going to be an increasing reality as many sites become less and less hospitable to tourists due to climate change. The next site I want to look at is a site on the Swahili coast of Tanzania. This is a site called Kilwa Kisawani. It, alongside its sister town, its sister city, a place called Songo Monora, were two of the most significant and important cities in Africa, in fact, in the world, in the medieval times between the 13th and 16th century. As you can see from the red star here, this was situated right on the Swahili coast and acted as a trading center for gold and ivory coming from the center of Africa, traveling around the Indian Ocean. And coins from Kilwa have been found as far away as Indonesia, right? And we have Ming and other period China pottery from China present in the stratigraphic layers at Kilwa Kisawani. It was an incredibly important and very, very large city for 200 to 300 years, at a time when in other parts of the world there really was very, very little going on. But as we have the narrative of resilience at Skellig continuing into this narrative of conservation, so at somewhere like Kilwa, we have this dichotomy where the sea, which has made this such a significant and important site, is now the thing that's actually threatening its preservation, right? And most specifically, it's suffering from extreme coastal erosion, right? And this is threatening not just the archaeological site. So I visited this site years ago, just after a major storm, and this whole section of the city, the archaeology, the unexcavated subsurface features, had just eroded out and fallen into the ocean, right? And in this, you can see the walls, you can see the plaster, you can see the foundations, right? This was lost in a single storm. But Kilwa, like so many archaeological sites, is also a contemporary settlement. It's also places where people live and go about their daily lives. And so these impacts are not just felt on the archaeological site, they're also felt by members of the local community. And in response to this, there's been a couple of different approaches, but this is one of these wonderful cases where actually a restoration of the local natural ecosystem has been one of the most effective ways to prevent coastal erosion. So in this coast, planting of mangroves in front of the monuments has been an incredibly effective way of taking the erosive power out of these storminess and out of this coastal, out of these waves, and actually protect the site. And within this, you have a system that both increases biodiversity, it increases carbon mitigation, and it actually protects the archaeological site from erosion. Coupled with this has been the addition of certain hard adaptation measures, including the construction of this long, small wall in front of the 11th century Malindi Mosque. This is one of the oldest mosques on the continent of Africa. It's an incredibly significant archaeological site, but there's also an accompanying graveyard where human remains were being eroded out onto the beach. And the construction of this small wall has done a lot alongside the planting of mangroves to reduce the impact from coastal erosion. The third site I want to look at, and so I kind of figured when it's a bit of a cold, grey weather in Northern Ireland, it's always nice to show pictures of lovely places, isn't it? And we can all kind of think what it would like to be warm in these places. Is the great city of Petra. I assure you it's there. There we go, it's back. Now you see it, now you don't. And I mean, Petra, of course, needs very little in the way of introduction. We again have this incredible narrative of resilience, of people adapting to live within an extreme landscape. It's obviously one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. I actually had the great pleasure of watching Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade with my 10 and 12-year-old for the first time a few weekends ago. Which, of course, the great temple, the treasury at Petra, was featured in that. So it's an incredibly iconic and important site. As I said, it's an arid landscape already. It's situated in the Jordanian desert, and it's one where people have evolved to adapt to a harsh climate. But like with Skellig, except to a much larger extent, Jordan's values extend just beyond it being an important archaeological site to it being an important religious site for the local community. It is the historical burial place of Aaron, brother of Moses, who was buried on the mountain above Petra. It's also by the town of Wadi Musa, which is where Moses struck the rock to bring out water. So it has huge religious significance to the local population as well. But it also makes up a good double-digit percentage of Jordanian GDP, right? Everybody who goes to Jordan goes to Petra. And Petra has always had challenges with water management. It's situated in a low part of the landscape, and when it rains, the water congregates. And it was used to having these bad flash floods about once every 15 to 20 years. In the last 10 years, they've been happening almost yearly. And I just want to play a video to illustrate some of the impacts that these are happening at this site. This video was taken on May the 4th this year, when unfortunately several people lost their lives and the entire site had to be evacuated because of flash flooding, because of rain collecting in the landscape, pouring down, finding its way through these ravines, pouring down and literally catching people out. And there's nowhere to go. You know, you're in this narrow, confined landscape. And the Jordanian government has done amazing work with early warning systems, amazing drills to get people out of the World Heritage Site. But there's often just not a lot of notice as to how quickly this happens. And this is happening at increasing speed, it's happening more and more. It used to be something, as I said, that only happened once every decade. But it's now happened 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years. And they're having to adapt to it even more. But Petra is one of these wonderful examples of where we can actually find a solution from the past to help us in the present. Now, in each of these case studies, I'm providing what seem to be quite simple linear narratives about here's a site, here's its history, here's its climate impact, and here's the response, right? Of course, it's more complicated than that. There are many climate impacts affecting these places. And what I'm doing is I'm picking out ones to illustrate the relationship between climate impact and climate response. But in the mountains surrounding Petra, we have an entire archaeological landscape full of terraces and dams and 2,500-year-old systems to manage the flow of water across that landscape. Now, over the last millennia or two, and specifically in the last 100 years, this is a landscape which has become deforested. It is a landscape that has switched from growing plants and crops to one of pastoral agriculture. And this infrastructure has fallen apart, right? And one of the things that the Petra Regional Development and Tourism Authority and my friend Tahir Falahat here has been leading on is a project to actually restore these ancient terraces and these ancient dams, because they have done studies, and which have been well published at this point, to show that with these in place, it buys significant amounts of time and prevents and gives people more time before the floods actually hit the center of the city. So by preserving and by fixing up these 2,500-year-old barriers, these 2,500-year-old dams and terraces, they are building resilience into the system to make these flash flood events less deadly. It's not often we have a direct example of ancient technology helping us in the present, but this is a really, really powerful one. The final case study I want to look at then, and we're really doing a tour of the great spots here, but these places have wonderful capacity to teach us about resilience. And Angkor itself is an enormous site. At one stage, it was deemed to be the largest urban center in the world with over 1 million inhabitants. It stretches over 400 kilometers squared, and was the center of the Khmer Empire, which stretched from 9th to the 15th centuries, at various times expanding and contracting over that time, as these empires are wont to do. Climate impacts here are more subtle in some ways, but nonetheless pretty severe. There are changes in rainfall patterns, which are leading to an expansion of vegetation, which are having a negative impact on the masonry. In reality, for a site this size, this is a drop in the ocean, considering the conservation challenges they have anyway, right? But the real thing that's affecting Angkor on a day-to-day basis is the increase in heat, okay? So over the next 30 to 50 years, the temperature of Angkor is due to go up by about 3 degrees. In the hottest periods, right? This means that it is regularly now reaching 40 degrees, 41 degrees, 42 degrees, and this is a very, very open site, right? And this is having an enormous impact on not just the people who work there, who have had to change their entire conservation activities and the knock-on effects that has, but also on tourists visiting the site. If you look at TripAdvisor reviews for Angkor, you increasingly see that tourists are struggling with the extreme heat, right? They're not enjoying, they're visiting less, they're having to leave early. There are significant health benefits from increasing heat, which is affecting tourism and visitation at the site. And the response actually over the last 20 to 30 years, and more so in the last 10 years, has been the construction, has been the planting of significantly more forests around the site. So around the major temple complexes, they've been planting more and more trees, and these act as a cooling effect on the site. They also provide shelter for tourists when visiting, right? It doesn't directly address the temperature, but it does create a better experience for tourists. So there's our whistle-stop tour around the world, looking at some examples of climate impact, but also, I hope, some examples of responses, right? The truth of the matter is, though, that no matter what we do, right, no matter how much we're able to reduce emissions, no matter how many walls we build, how many mangroves we plant, we are still dealing with a future that's going to involve a significant amount of what climate science calls loss and damage, okay? This is despite mitigation, despite adaptation, we are going to lose things, and we are already losing things. And internationally, this is broken down into two main categories. The first is what's called economic loss and value. And these are defines things which, you know, a monetary value can be applied to. It's the loss of people's homes, it's the loss of businesses, it's things which can be directly compensated for in the context of loss. But what is more challenging is actually what is called non-economic loss and damage. And this applies to the loss of things where one cannot simply apply a monetary value to it, where one cannot say, this cost £2 million, here's a check, right? And heritage falls into this category of non-economic loss and value. And it's very difficult to know how we as a society, both within the UK, but also internationally, how we respond to these losses and damages, because they're often acutely, personally, and individually felt. And they extend far beyond just the loss to archaeological sites. Okay, and I say just loss to archaeological sites is a hugely significant thing. But globally, it extends to, you know, the loss of local traditions, the loss of farming stories, of ways of engaging with the landscape. It relates to the loss of cultural and sacred sites, springs which dry up, or rivers which are no longer accessible. It relates to the loss of people's health and well-being, not being able to visit places anymore, not being able to get out and see these places, right? Its loss is huge, and it's acutely felt. And heritage generally defies monetary valuation. And so what's the challenge, right? This is increasingly called, and this is a phrase initially coined by Historic England, of what's called adaptive release. So this slide in the background is a site called Hurst Castle in England. Significant work over the years went into trying to preserve and fix this. And in recent years, there's been just an acceptance that this site is going to be lost, right? There's nothing we can do about it. And that is the reality, unfortunately, for an awful lot of our heritage sites going forward. But I was at an event last year in London, and somebody from the National Trust said, you know what, if we're going to lose these sites, let's at least make sure we lose them well, right? And I was sitting there thinking, and I don't think there was many archaeologists in that audience, and I thought, well, that's kind of a mantra for us, isn't it? It's kind of what we do as archaeologists. We're going to lose things, let's make sure we lose them well. And the point I would make is that as archaeologists, we perhaps more so than any other part of the heritage sector, more than our colleagues in planning or geography, more than our friends in architecture and even historical preservation, in archaeology, we are used to this idea of loss, right? My first dig as an archaeologist was on a site not dissimilar to the one on the screen here, where it was a watching brief followed by some targeted excavations, followed by a bulldozer, and it's now a motorway, right? It doesn't feel great, but it's the reality of a lot of what we do in archaeology. And most of what we do, especially outside of the academy, is actually mitigative. We excavate sites, we dig sites prior to their loss. Even when we excavate sites as archaeologists, as academics, just with my level 2s, Joe here is going to be getting deja vu here, because just last week we were talking about the fact that archaeology is destruction, that when we dig deposits, when we dig up our contexts, we are recording them by record, but we are destroying them. But we're also a values-led process, and what I mean by that is in the act of excavation, we are recording these diverse values associated with places in a way that other disciplines don't, these non-economic values, the things that make places important. And so because archaeology is based on the presumption of loss and damage, I would say that it has unique insights into the climate change conversation. And I would say that this makes students of archaeology and our graduates, it puts us in a unique position to be able to respond to the challenges of the climate crisis. Because we're also very used to doing an awful lot with very little, right? You know, the dreams of the multi-million-pound European projects, even in that framework, we're still often coming up with excavation and sampling strategies for sites which are incredibly partial. So what have we done? Well, over the decades, we've developed tools and methodologies to get the most amount of information out of these places as possible. We've developed ways of doing test trenches. We've developed ways of micro-excavating using coring systems, right? We've developed post-excavation analytical techniques like sedimentary DNA, phosphate analysis, looking at pollen samples in soil, all these things which help us build a narrative which tell us about the value of these places in the most efficient way possible. Often, like I said before, based on the presumption of future loss. And this idea of trying to get as much information as possible out of the site is enshrined in many of our core policy, our core guidance documents. So the Valletta Charter, the European Convention on the Protection of Archaeological Heritage, which defines commercial archaeological practice in Europe and the UK, identifies the importance of undertaking excavations in a robust, professional and scientific way. But it's also caused us to develop and borrow and adopt a lot of non-invasive technologies, right? The kind of technology that doesn't actually require excavation at all, right? And I'm one of those crazy archaeologists who actually quite likes policy. It makes me about pretty unique. But I think some of this stuff's actually very interesting. It's something like the Lausanne Charter, which is the founding document of international heritage management, makes it the overriding principle that gathering of information about archaeological heritage should not destroy any more archaeological heritage than necessary. And non-destructive techniques, aerial ground survey, sampling, should therefore be encouraged whenever possible. And this was 94, so it was even before the advent of a lot of the remote sensing, non-invasive techniques we have now, like, for example, LiDAR, right? Not a technique developed by archaeology, not even a technique developed for archaeology, but an incredibly powerful tool to tell us about the nature of heritage within the landscape, to give us insights into those non-economic values, often in landscapes that are at risk. The combination of technologies in terms of non-invasive, this is returning to the Great Mosque at Kilwa Kisawani. This is especially this forefront here, this is the earliest mosque on the continent of Africa. This is collected using a combination of laser scanning and drone flying. It was captured in about half a day, okay? So, you know, if we think about the techniques that we have developed within archaeology to record places rapidly, and we think about that within the context of the speed and the inevitability of loss and damage, we have an incredibly powerful toolkit, you know, when it comes to actually preserving these places for future generations. Because we're not going to have time to jump in and excavate all these places, but we do have ways of getting as much information as possible out of it. We've already talked a little bit about how, as archaeologists, we are custodians of the past. And I always like to think that as archaeologists, we are in fact storytellers. We are in fact people who tell stories which often begin in the very deep past. And we put a human face on the bare bones of the monuments we often find ourselves working in. But it also makes us custodians to a deep library of information and data, which tells us about the resilience of people in the past, of how people adapted to some of these most extreme places. Now, I think we have to be slightly careful of these narratives. The climate crisis is not like past climate. In many ways, it is expanding beyond the capacity of people to adapt without significant help. And we also shouldn't be naive about the fact that most people in the past didn't adapt, right? The history is littered with failure, and each of that failure is a very difficult story of human loss. But I still think that our past and our archaeological past and what we can learn from it is a powerful tool when we think about resilience thinking to the future. Just in the last couple of slides, what I'd like to do is, having made this very convincing argument, and hopefully you're all sitting there thinking, Will's right, you know, archaeology is going to save the world, right? I want to point out the fact that there's a justice and equity angle on this too as archaeologists, which is that our own discipline has a history that is not always particularly proud in terms of how it has engaged with people in the past. And because climate change is a global challenge and because our response is global, it would be remiss of me to suggest that archaeology holds one of the answers to responding to loss and damage without also acknowledging that for many communities around the world, climate loss is not something new. It's actually an extension of the losses they have felt for many centuries. Losses caused by colonialism, losses caused by poverty, losses caused by ongoing inequality. And so in many of these places, archaeologists have often contributed to this sense of loss and damage. We can all think of cases where, in a colonial context, archaeologists have engaged in activities which we would now deem to be deeply immoral. And that has made and continues to make many communities around the world deeply distrusting of archaeology. And I think we have to acknowledge that if we're going to engage openly and honestly about those things. And just as loss from climate change may be an extension of historical loss, so also loss from archaeology may be seen by some. Because cultures don't all view loss the same way, right? To some, the loss of heritage, even if it is preserved, even if it is recorded, even if we are doing all the archaeology wrong, is still a loss that is deemed to be unacceptable. And this is where we come back to the role of communities, right? And this is where we come back to the point that as archaeologists, our days of going in and telling communities what they should be doing, I really believe are over, right? We need to be working with communities. And I love this quote. This was from one of the first sites we did in Preserving Legacies. Our colleagues at the Ifugao, who live in the northern Luzon of the Philippines, they're an indigenous people. The first thing any Ifugao person will tell you is that they're the only people in the Philippines who held off the Spanish invasion. They're very proud of this fact, and they're a proud nation of people. And during this project, the aim wasn't that we would go in and tell them how to preserve their cultural heritage. We worked with them for years, and we provided heritage, and we learned from them, and they shared with us, and we shared with them. And their feedback in the report was, you know, by entrusting this process to them, it ensured that assessment captured the nuanced vulnerabilities and resilience strategies unique to us, which are often overlooked in conventional assessments led by external experts. By placing communities at the heart of this process, they were able to capture better the values, the things that are important, the things which make these places significant. And I think that whereas this is an example from the Philippines, I also think it has lessons for us working within Europe as to how we need to be working more with communities when it comes to heritage conservation. So I'm at 50 minutes, which is a bit more than I thought. But just in conclusion, I suppose my main message here is having contextualized this broader picture of loss, right? And having, I hope, also shown that it's not entirely hopeless, that there are good and wonderful things happening, and illustrated the value of heritage in this response. I suppose the point I'd like to make, standing in a university with some of my students in the audience, is my firm and fervent belief that archaeology has a really essential role to play in preserving cultural heritage in a broader sense in the future, right? Far beyond just what we currently do, because we're uniquely situated to respond to loss, capturing and understanding the immense importance of these places and working with communities to ensure that there is a future for some of our most precious things in the past. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much indeed. I find that very thought-provoking indeed, and I think really, really important. Meeting, and
Might be the last
you
bit
know,
of sunlight any of us see in a few months. So.
well, you know, I was sort of thinking, gosh, this is really rather depressing. But I think, you know, as you say, that there is hope. Local people, community level involvement is key.
Yeah, absolutely.
To it, especially when some of our global leaders, shall we say, just choose to ignore the fact that climate change.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, would you be prepared to take a few questions?
I'd be absolutely delighted to. Yeah, no, very happy to if anybody has any.
Right. Yes, please.
Mm-hmm. It's a really, really good question, and I would also probably, given we'll answer. Well, I'll try and comment on your question, but I'm going to do that political thing where I use it to segue into something else. We talk about impacts on sites. Tourism represents 12% of global emissions in the world. So how do we balance protecting our sites with the reality of the fact that tourism is a significant contributor to climate change, which is causing the damage to those sites in the first place, right? So I'm going to put that out there. There was a very important charter called the International Tourism Charter, and it used to use the phrase that visitation of these special places is both a right and a privilege for humanity, right? And it kind of set up this idea that people have an automatic right to visit places, right? Which is kind of challenging, right? Because like you said, they may cause damage. And then you're also balancing this off against the fact that there's an equity issue here too, which is who is traveling to these places and who gets the opportunity to see this and where are they coming from. So, you know, probably more people from Britain have been to Angkor Wat than people from Thailand, which is next door. Right? These sites are very, very important to local economies and communities. We can't just turn around and say, actually, you know, people shouldn't go there anymore. You know, your Venices and your Barcelonas are kind of unique extreme examples in a European context of where locals have actually said no more tourists, right? But around the world, tourism forms an incredibly important part of local economies. So all I've done is made your point better there, and I don't really have an answer to this except to say that I think some of the answers lie in slower tourism, right? In people within Europe being happier visiting the amazing heritage they often have on their back door. I once gave a talk on over-tourism to students in UCD, actually on a program Courtney did, and more people in the room had been to Machu Picchu than had been to Brunabónia. That's mad, right? That's mad. And I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Machu Picchu. Brunabónia is every bit as amazing, right? So I think a part of it is changing that wanderlust, right? It's making sure that when people do choose to travel, they have really deep and fulfilling experiences that are beneficial to the local community and don't cut the local community out. It is, unfortunately, I think, limiting numbers in many cases, right? In terms of accessibility and thinking about how people visit places. Because the thing about over-tourism as well is that, you know, over-tourism doesn't just damage the physical fabric of places. In fact, in many places, it doesn't damage the physical fabric of places. It does damage how much people enjoy going to places. I mean, lots of people go to major tourist sites and, you know, you look on TripAdvisor and their reviews is, I couldn't see anything, there were too many people there. It's like that old saying, you know, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. You know, like, you know, there's that aspect of it as well. And then you're degrading the resource in terms of the value to the local population of people being able to go there. So I think like the balance is almost certainly on a site-by-site basis. It will often involve limiting the number of people who go there. But I think there's a very important justice and equity question on who gets to share the benefit of these places and the importance to local communities as well.
Can I ask a question on top of that then?
Especially because I didn't really answer your question, so yeah.
Have so many sites that are practically unknown. I mean, take for example the giant ring outside Belfast. You could go there, there's nothing, but you go to Brunebonia, there's visitor centre, there's information.
Sure.
As an archaeologist, what do you think the government should be doing about a tourism profile of all of across Ireland's cultural and historical heritage that's available to see to tourists, to spread out the bodies?
Yeah, so it's called honeypot tourism. Okay, so Giant's Causeway is the honeypot. All the bees go to the honeypot, right? The fact that there are 20 other incredible archaeological sites within half an hour's drive of that nobody visits, right? Because everybody wants to go and get their Instagram picture, you know, taken at the Giant's Causeway. I think some good things are being done. I think things like the Wild Atlantic Way, which moves the focus away from individual sites to actually traveling, the experiences, the journey. I think that works very well. It's very, very hard to break the honeypot phenomenon top down. Countries who are attempting to do it at the moment include Nepal. So Nepal now have a rule that if you want to get a license or permission to climb Everest, you have to commit to climbing 5 other mountains in the Himalayas before you get that. So it's the aim is to spread the balance out amongst other places, right? You know, I think engaging tour operators is a big part of this. And I think actually education is a big part of this. You find that countries that have more robust training for things like tour guides and more mandatory rules on tour guides in terms of visitation experience tend to have a more diverse heritage offering, because they'll be able to say, well, you know what, the Giant's Causeway, it's, you know, if we get there at 11, it's going to be absolutely heaving with people. So let's go to Dunluce first, and then let's go to Oisin's Grave, and then we'll arrive at the Giant's Causeway at 4 o'clock, and actually it'll be quite quiet, and everybody will have a nice time, right? So you're alternating the experience in certain ways, and you're also thinking about more than just archaeology. I think when they do studies on why people travel, everybody's got a first reason to travel. You know, be it archaeology or bird watching or crafts or whatever. Almost everybody's second reason is food and drink. You know, like that's what people talk about. So if you think about diversifying things in terms of people's experience and promoting those alternative offerings, I think, you know, that's really, really important. Yeah.
Awesome. I have another one to ask on top of that, but I don't want to.
I can't see any other hands, so.
Well, with regards to the tourism aspect, many of the communities are settled around some of these sites globally. They're more interested in the economic benefit than they are of the actual building. I mean, how do we get them interested in heritage when they have a maybe low level of education? Maybe they're just struggling to get by and make enough money. Is there a balance to be struck there?
Yeah, I mean, probably trying to respond to underlying poverty is kind of important. You know, on one level, that sounds a bit preachy, but yeah, I mean, I think we also need to be, if we flip that on its head, we also sometimes place a massive onus on protecting the buildings, but not the people who live in the buildings. And I think we need to be aware of that and not be too and focused on it. Funnily enough, when we do community focus groups, so at both Angkor and Petra, which are arguably two of the most famous, heritage sites, and honeypot tourism sites, in both places, the number one thing that was most important to people in their landscape wasn't heritage or tourism; it was agriculture. Right? That was interesting. We weren't expecting it. We were expecting it to be about the economic benefits. Now, in fairness, a lot of people were involved in agriculture and tourism, but it was that sense of kind of loss. I think that there's a couple of responses to it in terms of, one needs to validate and valorize heritage as something that is both has heritage significance and economic importance. Often the kind of slightly mercenary approach to heritage you get from some communities is maybe because they've been alienated from the process previously. So how many sites can we think of where we go to a visitor center and it's run by a foreign company, and people who live around the site don't even have access to go to the site? So they're already alienated from this resource. They already resent the people involved, even if they make money out of people who go there, and that can be a real challenge. Yeah, well, no, because I think it's also the fact that like there's immense pride in these places for people, and I think again it's diversifying the offering of what's possible to give to people. I mean, some of the stuff they started doing in Petra, for example, is the guides are all kind of local, and you can do a tour of the site, and then you can go out into the desert and have a traditional meal with somebody in their family, right? And then the next morning you can get up and you can go and look at medicinal plants in the landscape, right? That's a win-win for everybody. It's definitely a better and stronger experience. And actually, if you look at experiences, and I mean, there are studies on this, but I'm sure it will be reflected in the room. If you ask people what the most positive experience of visiting some of these places was, one of the most common answers is, we had an amazing local guide who just knew so much about everything, who grew up in the area and was able to tell us not just about the archaeology, but about how this plant stopped fever and this plant stopped menstrual cramps, and how his grandfather had used to bring goats up and down the mountain and stuff like that. And that's definitely a win-win in terms of preservation of culture, tangible and intangible, and also creating less mercenary economic models.
On top of what you're saying, when you talked about Rapa Nui, that is now becoming a horrible sight in terms of practically no one on the island isn't employed in tourism. All the hotels are owned by offshore investors. There's not enough water for the locals. By the time tourists have come, it's a real imbalance. I'm just curious about what that heritage can do to not destroy the very thing we love.
So Rapa Nui is an interesting example. It's actually one I know a bit about. About 10 years ago, Management of Tourism Authority was devolved from Chile to the Mahanua, who are the management authority of the Rapa Nui. The Rapa Nui are the people as well, and the Mahanua are the elders of the Rapa Nui. And they have completely changed the model in that licensing. So foreign universities, for example, can't work there anymore. Licensing with regards to who can visit, who can't visit, is now managed locally. You still see the divisions because, you're always going to have divisions within communities. But there's a switch there to the more local management of sites, right, which I think is important. I mean, somewhere like Machu Picchu is another interesting example where certain aspects of the experience are managed local and certain aspects of the experience are managed through like a vulture capitalist fund based in Ankara, right? So the train you get there, which is the most expensive part of your journey, is owned by an offshore people. But once you get there, the buses are owned by local people, So you have this kind of Frankenstein tourism experience in terms of economics, which is really, really challenging going forward. So I lost my train of thought there, but yeah, I do think that the involvement and engagement of local communities in the management, and actually increasingly now, if you think from a UNESCO perspective, you can't get a site in the UNESCO list anymore unless there is clear and verified evidence of local and community support. Because there's been such bad experience in the past of governments making World Heritage sites and then the community are all completely isolated from it. And it's one of the biggest challenges now for sites to get on the World Heritage list is if they don't have community support, they just won't even be supported going through the process, you know.
Given your experience and knowledge of all this, how positive are you about the overall direction of travel? This is a very broad question, I know, but considering...
We start weeping into this microphone. It's hard to imagine that the direction of travel is looking particularly great, right? I think within that, though, there are very positive stories and there are positive examples. Within the UK, our own emissions have dropped significantly, and that's been largely to do with policy work. Around the world, we do have countries taking really positive actions. Most of the projections for the worst case scenarios produced 10 years ago by organizations like the IPCC, who are the scientific people who project the futures. Most of the most pessimistic scenarios are now deemed highly improbable because of global action against climate change. I think that's all very positive. So I think that's good. I think there's a lot of hope in the younger generation who are incredibly climate literate and understand this as being an existential threat and the defining issue of their generation. Not all, but more and more, right? So I think there's a lot of hope in that. I think that's the other thing about working with communities, is that you get to see incredible groups of people do amazing work, and that's very helpful as well. So, I mean, the bigger picture of the climate crisis is undoubtedly, and it's just science, the worst is still to come. But I would try very hard to remain hopeful.
Getting to grips with the whole tourism thing and all the rest, and the effect on the sites, preserving what can be, or even recording. How positive are you about that? Actually, seeing, I mean, globally, I'm sure it varies across regions. What your overall take on that be?
Do you mean hope in the kind of
You're recording or preserving what's in the face of erosion through mass tourism or the climate change, all those things? How are we getting to grips with that overall?
Well, I suppose I think it's a very mixed picture, right? You have some places that are going backwards, the US at the moment. In terms of support, you have some places that continue to strike forward in terms of local empowerment. Just like Jordan, Brazil, they're doing really, really amazing work. You have a lot of parts of the world where, frankly, climate change just isn't the biggest issue they're dealing with. It's very hard to say to somebody, protect your sites from climate change, when you've got jihadists or bombs trying to destroy them. So I think it's a mixed picture, but I also think it's why. So I used to be the focal point for climate for a group called ICOMOS, which is a big international heritage organization. And I spent my first 2 years going to COPs and sitting in meetings and having all these top-down discussions. And I understand the fact that, you know, if you can get to grips with emissions, if you can get governments to take action, that's all very good. Where I find hope is in the sites that, I've closed it down now, but is in the communities and sites that we work with, because we set up that Preserving Legacies project in a kind of direct response to the idea that we felt change from top down was really difficult, but we felt it might be possible from the bottom up. And there's so many incredibly hopeful stories from those communities of people who started off as 1 or 2 people with an interest in climate change, and now it's on school curricula. You know, now there are countries that have national adaptation plans looking specifically at cultural heritage. You know, and seeing the kind of groundswell and the power that comes from that bottom up thing. Now, I'm sure in reality it needs both, but I find more hope in the bottom up kind of approach to it. But yeah, it's a very varied picture. I mean, for every place I could say, I think these are doing a really great job. I'm sure there are loads where they're not, you know. Yeah. Maybe we should just go out for a drink, you know, then we could just like...
It strikes me that we're, as a nation, we're going to have building houses and stuff like that. And how do you feel that going forward, archaeology is going to fit into the pressures on land usage in terms of, we have a lot of beautiful heritage sites, but they're also on prime development sites or important agricultural land sites.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's
So I'm just thinking of the green belt changes.
No, I get it, and when we have that right, so I think there's a kind of short term, medium, long term of that, right? The first thing I'd say is that within the UK, you know, the vast majority of buildings that people are going to live in 50 years' time have already been built, right? We have a very localized housing shortage in major urban areas. And even within those urban areas, we often have a very high level of vacancy, and that level of vacancy is particularly targeted often on historic buildings. So I think part of addressing the climate crisis is that we need to build less and retrofit more. And there's a huge role for archaeologists in heritage in the role of retrofitting and buildings management, right? And that would be an important thing. I think if we look at the demographics globally in terms of populations in 20, 30, 40 years, we're probably, you know, not going to be building as much. But I suppose the thing is about your question is it's kind of a bigger question as to where archaeology fits in, you know, with the housing crisis and the trade-offs that are important, and, you know, the values involved in the rights of people to live somewhere versus the rights of the preservation and conservation of heritage. And I mean, as somebody who thankfully was able to buy my own house like 5 years ago, I really feel sorry for the younger people. You know, I really do. And I think we have to be pragmatic and honest, just like we sometimes have to be pragmatic and honest about wind turbines or solar farms or building new things. You know, there's going to be a heritage cost to it. And like I said, we're used to dealing with that cost. And that doesn't mean that we're not very careful. It doesn't mean that where necessary, we don't advocate, we don't protest, we don't stop, we don't use our expertise to preserve the most important of what needs to be preserved. But I think there are already frameworks there that do a lot of that. You know.
Right, in that case, I think it just remains for me to say thank you. Oh, beg your pardon.
Sorry.
So sorry.
One question.
Who have I known online?
Here from Zoom. First one is, how do people get involved and contribute to efforts towards climate change and preserving heritage? Specifically those who are not archaeologists and are not able to physically help out quite as much.
Join your local Ulster Archaeology Society. No, or community groups like that, right? Local heritage sectors. Join next time they see a call for, you know, government advisory committees like the Historic Monuments Council, the Buildings Council. Join up. You know, those are not expert spaces; those are community spaces where people from all across the sector need to be able to join and have a say. You know. Archaeology is also not just for the able-bodied. You know, you don't have to be able to hop into a trench to be an archaeologist. There's all sorts of opportunities in terms of community archaeology. Incredible work being undertaken by the Centre for Community Archaeology across Northern Ireland now, and it's not all digging holes, right? There's other stuff going on as well. So I think there are opportunities. Now, they happen in certain places, and there mightn't be one exactly in where everybody is, but I think it's a question of being proactive and engaging with those things. I also think that an awful lot of policy and, you know, planning guidance and documentation is actually defined by a really small number of people who bother to comment on it, right? So development plans for towns, they put out for public consultation. Having sat in some of those committees, sometimes they get 3 or 4 comments and they're all just accept. You know, like, I think there are opportunities for us people to get involved, even if they're not heritage experts, in shaping the discourse on these things, and people should do that, you know, if they can. Yeah.
And the other question is, are there any methods of community involvement that you've seen being used in other countries that might be worth trying here in Ireland?
Oh, goodness me. Yeah, so, well, actually, I think we have models in Ireland already, right? And we just maybe don't use them very well in heritage. My first kind of postdoc after I finished my PhD, I worked for Teagasc, which is the Irish Agricultural Research Board down south. And they used to do something called tea diplomacy, which was that even if there was no issue, their regional officers would just go around and have cups of tea with people, right? It wasn't like they didn't want to compulsory purchase somebody's house or put up a wind turbine or do any of that. They just went around having tea with people, right? And then when they did need to ask for something, they knew who they were, right? I think so often we leave it too late in heritage and we go in once there's a problem, we go in when we actually need people and we haven't built the relationships before that. And I think that's something that already exists within our society and that we could do. I think social prescribing, a model from the UK, which is happening here increasingly, can be used, which is where, say, a doctor might prescribe somebody to go for a walk around a National Trust property as part of their treatment for dealing with agoraphobia or anxiety or something like that, increases the appreciation and the value people see in heritage. If we think about COVID and how important every special place within 5 miles of our house became to all of us, right? We can see the importance of local heritage. So I think those models are already here. I think the nature of community engagement is that it tends to be incredibly localized and specific to individual communities. So I have friends in Switzerland who used to do something called Salon de Thé, which is a kind of Enlightenment idea where people came together and shared tea, and it was like a talking group for people. In the Philippines, they had like a weaving circle where people came together to weave, and they wove narratives into the cloths, and those cloths told stories, and people came together, probably much like a knitting group, opportunities like that. I think anything that just gets people to talk about things. I mean, one of the great challenges in this is that we used to always say in climate action that the important thing was getting everybody around the same table. Okay. But then we realized really quickly that it didn't matter if everyone was around the same table if people were speaking different languages and if some people didn't feel confident enough to contribute. So it's about creating spaces where people feel comfortable and valued and they feel like their opinion matters. And that's very, very important. Because if it's a table of 10 people and 9 of them have never done something like this before, and me, right? I mean, I can't stop talking here. Imagine what I'd be like in that situation, right? So you need to create an environment where people are actually confident in being able to chat. And that's often very, very culturally, specific. So. Thank you, Courtney.
Okay, well, this time I think we finally can say thank you very much indeed again, Will, for a really, really thought-provoking evening.
My ranting towards the end.
Small token of
thank you so
appreciation
much.
from
That's
us.
very
So
generous.
thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, just before we go, I'll just look at a couple of things. If anybody's finding it difficult to find somewhere to park this evening, it can be very tricky. But you can park in the main Queen's building area. If you go in by City Square, the barriers are open from, I think it's 4. So you can safely park in there. You can just walk across to here if you can't find anybody. Our spaces are long enough, would happen here as long as it fits and stuff. So that's just something to bear in mind for the future. Our next lecture on the 27th of October. So we're looking forward to that one.
Thank you.
So also just to let you know that our annual dinner you'll be emailed about that shortly. So you can go to dinner. So that's it for now. So thank you very much everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.